Hi everyone, and welcome to this online panel discussion with V&A Dundee in collaboration with Scotland and Venice. My name is Nicole Keane and I'm the creative programmer here at V&A Dundee, and I co-curated this event with our brilliant partners. Please do pop a hello in the chat box just to tell us who you are and where you're tuning in from. It's always really nice to know who's out there. I hope many of you have been able to come and see What If Scotland at V&A Dundee. If not, it is on show until November 21st, so there are a couple of days left to go and catch it. Before I get into the detail of tonight's event, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of the Zoom practical functions we're going to use tonight. As you can see, tonight's event is being BSL Interpreted by Heather and Bruce. You can spotlight Bruce and Heather's video by using the three dots on the top right-hand corner of their retrospective video boxes and selecting Pin Video. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the whole of this evening's event. Please do pop them in the Q&A box so we can address all of those at the end in the audience Q&A. And finally, if you would like to use the closed caption function, please just enable that on your bottom bar. Details on how to use all of these features have been posted in the chat as well. If you're going to talk about this event online, which we definitely do encourage, please do tag us at VA Dundee and at Scotland Venice, and please do use any of the speakers' social links that are going to be posted in the chat throughout the evening. Tonight, we are thrilled to be joined by a wonderful panel to channel and reconsider our built environment. We have asked our speakers to consider the question, what if young people designed our future? We are in a climate emergency. Urgent change is vital and possible, and young people today are the generation that are going to be most affected by climate change. And around the world, they're doing extraordinary things to challenge and change the way we live to save their future. Our built environments do not currently reflect the values and critically the needs of future generations. So tonight's discussion is going to be chaired by Ewan Anderson, an architect and urban designer who leads 7N Architects. Each panelist will present for approximately 5 minutes, and then that's going to be followed by a discussion, and then we'll move to an audience Q&A. Before we're joined by Ewan, I just wanted to invite Jim McDonald on, who is the Chief Executive of Architecture and Design Scotland, to say a few words about the Scotland and Venice partnership. Jim, if you can just pop your video on and say hi.
So I'm here on behalf of the Scotland and Venice partners to welcome you to the third and final of our public events as part of the What If Scotland exhibition. For those who don't know, the partners are Creative Scotland, the British Council, National Galleries of Scotland, Scottish Government, Architecture and Design Scotland, and as of now, the Victoria and Albert in Dundee, V&A Dundee. So it's great to have those represented tonight. So the partnership itself acts as the main funder and commissioning body, appointing a different curatorial partner or project for each biennale and working with the artists and architectural practices on those. Scotland and Venice is a major international initiative, and it's designed to promote the best of contemporary art and architecture practice from Scotland on a world stage. It was founded in 2003, and we support the development of new work and try to foster international connections and exchange. The aim of all this is to position Scotland internationally as a distinct, dynamic and diverse centre for creative excellence, fostering ambitious, innovative work in the fields of contemporary art and architecture, alongside professional dialogue, public engagement, cultural exchange, including opportunities for students in the art and architecture. And while Venice means a world stage for Scotland, it also provides us with a springboard to promote and celebrate the contribution of art and architecture at home through a parallel programme of events, exhibitions and resources, including things like tonight. It's fair to say this year has been quite different. What was planned as an exhibition in our new venue in Venice in 2020 has instead, and somewhat magically, become an exhibition at the V&A in Dundee. And the success of this and the level of engagement in particular that we have achieved is truly inspiring and absolutely something that myself and all the partners are keen to build on. Happily, as things stand, Scotland and Venice is planning to return to Venice in 2022 with a presentation of the work by the artist Alberta Whittle, and we're all very much looking forward to that and to future art and architecture exhibitions in the years that follow. So on behalf of all of the partners, thanks again for being with us tonight. I'm sure it's going to be great. And I'll now hand over to Ewan, who's going to chair the rest of the proceedings. Thanks.
I'm going to do a very short intro about what if this evening, because those of you who've been to the earlier events in the series will have heard a lot of this before, but tonight's focus really is on the perspective of young people on their places. And this really gets to the heart of what if's about, because what if is about engaging people in the future of their places and engaging people who are perhaps have felt disenfranchised from that process, and also perhaps lacking a sense of belonging. So the challenge for What If, going right back to the Venice Biennale curators challenge, was how will we live together? And the What If initiative was really about trying to cut through the layers of bureaucracy and process which really exist presently, and determine how places are created, to get down to just architects and designers talking very directly to citizens in their own communities and asking them to frame a wish, their hopes and dreams for the future of their places around a wish. And then each architect and designer was challenged with coming up with the what if idea that could respond to that. And we brought people together in pairs right around the country in 5 different places. So we had 25 citizens and 25 architects throughout Scotland, and each of the giving different perspectives of these in these places. And also we got a cross section of the community in each place, and there was always, we felt it was very important that young people were very involved, who don't normally get engaged with on the future of places. And what came out of this was a very powerful set of wishes for the future of these places. And the wishes are really at the heart of what this whole project's about. During the course of the exhibition, as well as the wishes for each of the citizens, all the visitors to the exhibition were invited to make their own wish about the future of the place, and we collected 10,000 in total. So the exhibition at the BAA finishes on Saturday, but perhaps one of the lasting legacies of the whole initiative is that the process demonstrated the power of engaging very directly with local people, and particularly hearing the voices of young people who are not normally heard in this process. So in a way, What If really brought out the importance and the urgent need to engage young people in the future of their places. It's never been more important when they will be the ones who will be inheriting the decisions that are made, the critical decisions that are made right now about the future of the planet and climate. So really the question for tonight is what if young people designed their future? And we have a great range of speakers tonight to explore these questions from different perspectives. So first of all, we have Graham Hogg, who's a director of Lateral North and also co-founder of After the Pandemic. And in Graham's role at Lateral North, he's led a range of projects focused on Nordic and Arctic regions, and also carbon neutral community projects within Scotland. Next up, we have Katrina Patterson, who's a volunteer and trustee of the 2050 Climate Group, helping communities create greener places throughout the country. We have Tita Parton, who's a recent graduate from Strathclyde, University of Strathclyde. She's working at Collective Architecture, where she is currently working on a range of retrofit and community-focused projects. We also have Beth, Kirsty, Noah, and Amy from Dundee's Young People Collective, which is a V&A code design initiative for 14 to 24-year-olds in the city of Dundee. And finally, we have Scott Mccauley, who is a climate justice activist, architectural designer, and coordinator of the Anthropocene Architecture School. And he's a Part 2 architectural assistant at Archetype, and also helps to coordinate ACAN's Climate Literacy Working Group, supports climate justice and tenants' right campaign in Scotland, and was our RABA Journal Rising Star in 2020, and is just about to collapse after doing virtually talks all day for the past 2 weeks during COP. So there's a fantastic range of perspectives tonight, and I'm going to now invite Graham to forward his thoughts on the question.
Thank you, Ewan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel this evening. So this evening, I am here to talk about after the pandemic. After the pandemic began last year during the first lockdown, and over the past two weeks as part of COP26, we have been running a fringe festival that we'll come on to in a little while. But one of our partners for COP26 was Pecha Kucha, which is 20 slides and with 20 seconds per slide. So I thought it was appropriate that I do this presentation in that sort of format. So after the pandemic began last year in April 2020, it was founded by myself and the rest of the team at Laurel North alongside Fergus Bruce and Laura McCard. Fergus is in the audience this evening. And we focus primarily around cultural and art installations, programs and content, educational toolkits, events, community engagement and outreach. And our focus is about becoming an accelerator for change where we incubate and enable creative projects that impact our societies, cities and environment for the better. Our team is made up of lots of different people from different backgrounds, as Fergus calls himself, a decommissioned philosopher, through to poets, environmental consultants, musicians, street artists, photographers, graphic designers, and a whole host of others from different backgrounds that are not necessarily creative. And our mission statement is about how we rethink our environment, reimagine our cities, and redesign our communities. And right from the start, this has been our mission statement. It was the first thing that we wrote down as part of a manifesto where we launched this when we were all sitting inside in April and May last year. And our work primarily focuses around how we incubate ideas. So that's through design schools, workshops, engagement exercises, and lots of other ways of doing that as well. How we then accelerate those projects, so connect up creative people with communities or vice versa, and involve them and engage them with each other as part of the process. And then how we create either physical installations or digital experiences as an output for each of those projects. Since we started, we have had a whole host of different outputs and engagements, ranging from local all the way to international. So if you want to listen to myself be dubbed into German, please go and find our appearance on German TV show ARD. But we've also delivered or enabled over 40 projects. We've got 10 projects in the pipeline, and we've also had a huge amount of online impressions, coverage across print, digital and radio, and are engaging with international organisations, including Indigenous communities. One of the first things that we set up alongside an organisation called Design Wains was the summer school, the after pandemic summer school. And that took place over June and July last year. And what we put together was 6 different design briefs, whereby we asked people to come up with an idea. And the majority of people who came back were all young people working together and collaboratively, when in some cases they'd never met each other before. So we connected up people who were architects with community activists, graphic designers alongside musicians and a whole host of other people. And so the six briefs are on screen at the moment, and it was a really exciting project to be part of, where we had lots of industry leaders as well as politicians involved in the process as part of that as well. And one of the things that came out of that was a project called Under the Bridge. So Under the Bridge began in the cathedral-like space under the Kingston Bridge with Sarah Wagner in the top image on this slide. She's a violinist, and she realized quite early on that she wasn't going to play in a concert hall for at least a year. So took it upon herself to try and find spaces within the city whereby she could actually keep on performing. We worked alongside her, and then we asked a street artist called Panda, that's in the middle image, to come along and be involved in a performance piece that we're putting together alongside Sarah, and he jumped at the opportunity to be involved. And it was a really good piece that was then juxtaposed between this classical music and the street art. And that has then subsequently continued in a number of other projects whereby we're not just doing Under the Bridge, so we've done it per season. So we've done summer, we've done winter, we've done spring, and now we're doing autumn at the moment as well. And this is something that started off as just simply an idea, just myself, our photographer and filmmaker Simon, and Sarah standing under the Kingston Bridge and recording her with a violin. And then 2 Fridays ago, we actually performed to over 120 people within Glasgow Cathedral, bringing together lots of different musicians, all of them students or just recently graduated students from the Royal Conservatoire. And that just showed itself the power of young people and how they can be involved in these projects. And that brings us on to that project that at Glasgow Cathedral was part of after the pandemic and its response to COP26. So as part of after the pandemic at COP26, we worked alongside a number of organisations, Pitch Kucha being one, but also People Make Glasgow, Edinburgh Napier University, Daydream Believers, IES, which is a local Glaswegian company, Lego and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and then also HCI Skills Gateway. And we brought together all of these organisations to bring young people together in a space that was inclusive, that allowed conversations to happen, that had events and a whole host of different things that took place. And this is a quote that's just from that Mark Dytham, of one of the co-founders of Pitch Kucha, had recently posted on his LinkedIn, and it was something that for us as after the pandemic was a really kind of emotional piece to get, because it was effectively describing the space as we always wanted it to be. There was an inclusive space, it was free, it was open to anyone, and not just students, but also young people, but also to the public at large. And that resulted in there being a number of opportunities where young people were presenting to adults, to world leaders, to lots of different people. As part of our engagement with Lego, we ran 2 workshops called Build a Change every single day, and we had in the Strathclyde Union 2 different school groups or at least two different school groups every day. This is the children from Stowe Primary School. They could not wait to be involved with the Lego workshops, but also being in the city, being active as part of COP26, and responding to the climate emergency. They came along and they presented their own ideas that were in film format. They were in poem and rap, and a whole host of other things as well. But I think for me, this is a photo that I took myself, and it was just standing behind these kids who all had on the back of their t-shirts that we are the change, and I couldn't agree more with them. We also had young people as part of International Inuit Day. So this was a series of young people who came along from different parts of the world. So from Greenland, from Alaska, and also from Scotland. It was a session that focused on young people and the engagement between the Nordic and Arctic regions, and how they can all collaborate and be involved with each other as the Arctic becomes an extremely important region in response to the climate emergency. We also had the Social Enterprise Academy Dragon's Den was hosted as part of after the pandemic at COP26. And we had 18 different schools ranging from primary schools and secondary schools. And they each pitched their ideas about how they could respond to the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in at a local level. They had presented products, they presented ideas, they presented designs, and it was a brilliant event that took place. And then this is Colin Lee, who designed a mural that has recently been put onto one of the arches alongside the expressway that runs through Glasgow. Unfortunately for Colin, he was not able to actually see his finalised design until this week, because of all the restrictions around COP26. So the piece was in one of the arches that just sits out outside SWG3, but it was only actually delegates who were able to see this. So we had him in after the pandemic last week, and he was the star of the show by Planet Pod. So if you want to go and find that episode, you can listen to us talk about after the pandemic, but more importantly, listen to Colin talk about the work that he done. And then just finally, just want to touch on another, we very much wanted to focus on creativity and design as part of COP26 and bringing together artists and musicians and filmmakers to our space. On the right is a number of Johnny Cipher, who is a Glasgow rapper, and he led a group of rappers who done a piece or a concert as part of after the pandemic, and that was partly sponsored by Celtic Connections and People Make Glasgow. But on the left was effectively their support act, and Johnny Cipher just kept on talking about how amazing they were, and all three of them are just are students at the Royal Conservatoire. And this was something that the quote at the bottom was something that was said during COP26 as part of after the pandemic, and I think it's very resonant that we need to have lots of different people involved in the climate emergency, and that also includes artists. And so I think that this was something that we talked about as part of all the musical performances, that we can't all speak at the same time, but we can all sing at the same time. And I just want to finish on, at the moment, we have, much like Scott that you're going to hear from, we've spent pretty much the last 6 months to a year focused on a local response to COP26. And that has primarily been led by the 5 principles that you see on the screen at the moment. However, I think it's become quite obvious to us that one of the things that's clearly missing, but is a thread that runs through all of the work that we do, is the engagement with young people. So we're currently in the process of looking at the legacy for after the pandemic, and as you can see, we've got 6 different icons here. One that is currently undefined. From our perspective, we're looking at how young people can be that 6th principle that guides after the pandemic, and any young people who are involved today who would like to be involved and engage, as whether you're from Glasgow or elsewhere, we are looking at how we can expand after the pandemic out with the city and offer it up as a toolkit to others around Scotland and around the world. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please do get in touch with us at info@afterthepandemic.scot. And I will pass on to Katrina, who is going to be the next presenter.
Thanks, Graham. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the panel today. So my name is Katrina, and there's a couple of things I'm thinking about when I'm coming to this conversation. So I'm coming from the background of being a young person, actively working to influence and to try and change the systems which reduce, constrict, stop climate action being able to take place. I'm a volunteer and a trustee of a charity called 2050 Climate Group, which seeks to empower young people to take climate action in different ways across the different areas of their life. And when I'm talking about young people, I specifically focus on the age group of 18 to 35, which to some people isn't young, but to others is very young. It's that kind of tricky time of life when you are not in formal education, you don't have the kind of existing systems of eco skills and things to kind of get you into climate change, but you also don't necessarily have the professional status or kudos or agency to be considered a change maker or, crucially, a decision maker. So that's one area of things. But I'm also coming to the conversation as someone who has been exploring the impacts of climate change on our built environment and our communities, specifically how warmer, wetter and wilder weather in Northwest Europe will shift how we live and experience culture in our cities, and how creativity can help guide us through that difficulty, but also what direct impact climate will have on our culture. So as part of a project which I was working on called Cultural Adaptations, I was working with artists in different cities to think about different ways of engaging with the climate crisis. And a lot of those artists were focusing on the people who are often excluded from decision making on our urban built environment, particularly young people. So intergenerational equity is something that I come back to a lot, and something which I think is often missing when it comes to decision making, no matter whether it's at a local, regional, national, or perhaps even sometimes a household level. And fundamentally, I think that when it comes to making decisions about how we address our climate crisis, and yes, how our built environment should reflect that crisis, we need to shift our expectations of decision makers, and we need to shift the expectations of those decision makers around how young people can feed into discussions and what value they bring to those discussions. We are the people who have the most skin in the game. We're going to be around to see the change in action. I always like to confess in any conversation, I'm going to be 54 in the year that Scotland meets its net zero commitments, 2045. So, you know, I'm looking at the kind of second half of my life being in a net zero Scotland. And so I'm really invested in making sure that's a positive place for me to live, for my family to live, and something that I can be proud of in the future. A little bit about how 2050 Climate Group tries to do this. So we have a leaders network, which has over 500 young people who are committed to taking climate action and who have been through a skills and training program to equip them to do so, which we run for free at the point of access. And we try and think of different ways that young people can be involved, acknowledging that not everyone has the same agency, the same capacity, or the kind of same time and resource to do so. So we talk about kind of there being three spheres of agency for young people to take action. The first, their personal sphere. So that's about how do you work within your kind of peer group, with friends, with family, with the values that you use to kind of live your life and make your decisions. Everything from where are you going to live, how are you going to get about, what are you going to eat, that kind of thing. The second sphere is the professional one, and that's where we talk about historically there's been an idea of there being green jobs, but I think more and more we're seeing that every job, every part of our economy, every part of our society will be having to be actively engaged in climate change. So it's more about, if you're in a green job already, great, become the decision makers that are taking climate action. But if you are in education, finance, healthcare, kind of any other workplace, how can you think about how climate change will affect what you do, and crucially, where can you take action? And then it wouldn't be a chat about the systemic barriers to young people participating in decision-making around climate change without talking about the political sphere. So that's, I think, the greatest source of frustration amongst the young people that I'm talking to, that young people are often cited as the motivation for taking climate action, but very little are they actually directly able to be making those decisions themselves. And I think it was interesting. I was also at COP in the last couple of weeks, and it was great to see so many young people on panel discussions, particularly in the blue zone and the green zone. But they were always still there as a young person, not necessarily as someone in their own right who has an equal voice. It was always somewhat tokenistic, I felt. So just to kind of wrap up my provocation, that was the kind of word that was used when describing our kind of little intros today. It's a thought that's kind of been burling around my head a wee bit. So I was recently helping to edit an educational book and resource for young people that was exploring how, looking back from 2025, exploring how the COVID-19 pandemic had spurred a green revolution. And as part of this, the author described the generation war that resulted because of COVID-19, and specifically because of the generational inequity that was caused through both the health impacts on older and younger people respectively, but also the restrictions that were placed on older and younger people. And I think sometimes that sense of blame that was kind of put on young people as well. And And that was set off against a growing frustration at a lack of action from older people who were still actively contributing to climate change or wouldn't be around to see the impacts of their actions. So I'm not all out war here at all. It's a very scary prospect. But I think in talking about how and why we enable people to lead on climate action, well, young people to lead on climate action, I think it's also really important to consider what happens if we miss that opportunity. So that's me, and I'm going to pass on to Tia.
Hi, thanks, Katrina. Just a second, I'll share my screen. So I'm Tia from Collective Architecture, and I'm here to talk about how Part 2s and early career architects can be involved in creating more sustainable built environments through their practice. So architecture especially has such a huge potential impact on not just the building industry's carbon emissions, but on things like creating green spaces, promoting active travel, and designing socially sustainable places as well. So I'll also be talking about how collective architecture as a practice has been responding to the climate crisis in both our internal strategies and in specific projects. So right after graduating from University of Strathclyde, I was lucky enough to join a practice who are already working towards sustainability goals. And a huge part of this is like a good green internal strategy. So last year, Collective Architecture launched a sustainability division specifically, so it's called Collective Energy. And this division works with clients and other team members to develop their projects to be both climate neutral and socially sustainable. And it offers things like circular economy consultation, building performance services, and also passive house design. So our practice actually employs 6 passive house designers, which is quite a bit considering there's like 50 of us. We have multiple passive house standard projects already in the planning and early construction stages as well. But when we're talking about something as huge as making the building industry carbon neutral, it's also important to consider not just new build design, but also to look at the performance of existing buildings, especially somewhere like the UK, which has one of the oldest housing stocks in Europe. So Collective Energy also advises on the EnerFit standard, which can result in up to a 90% reduction in heating and demand in older homes. So I thought I'd also share 3 projects today as examples. And the first one is a retrofit project called the regeneration of the Woodside Tower Blocks. It's in the north of Glasgow. And the idea was to tackle fuel poverty while also creating an exemplar for shifting towards retrofitting these existing high-rise housing blocks. And all 3 blocks now have new insulation, modern controllable heating and hot water systems, and triple glazed windows. And by retrofitting rather than demolishing these tower blocks, the whole life carbon footprint of the buildings is likely to be closer to net zero than most new builds. And as you can see, one of the tenants hasn't even switched on his heating for the last 2 years. And I'll also talk a little bit about one of our ongoing passive house projects. So this is called the Powder Hall facility, which is an intergenerational facility in Edinburgh. So it combines early learning and childcare facilities with homes for older people. And to help combat loneliness, the project aims to create spaces where these elderly residents and then the children can coexist in shared green spaces and courtyards and little communal facilities like that. And it's said to be the first housing development by the City of Edinburgh Council to meet the passive house standard. And it's also linked to like this planned network of cycling routes and pedestrian routes called the Quiet Routes Network. And the third project I'd like to mention is something that I'm currently involved in, and it's called the Livable Neighborhoods Project in Glasgow. It's sort of based on the 20-minute neighborhoods idea that's going around the world. And Collective Architecture just joined this year. And we're looking at the East End and Govan, and we're seeking to create quality public spaces and to also rebalance the way streets are designed and used to make them friendlier to pedestrians and cyclists, rather than having everything taken up by cars and parking. And so we're speaking to locals at the moment and holding workshops and letting people draw out maps of where they think their neighborhoods lie and where they would like to see things changed, and sketching out the favorite bits of the neighborhoods, and also sketching out like maybe they're passing by broken glass every day and just like barriers to what they would consider to be a nice neighborhood. And because I live in the East End myself, I feel like I have a really good chance to positively influence my own surroundings in a very tangible way. So in conclusion, I'd like to talk about the industry as a whole, sort of responding to my provocation as well. So while a collective architecture as a practice might be a bit ahead of the curve in terms of sustainability strategies, I feel like the industry as a whole is shifting more towards sustainability quite rapidly even. I graduated this year from the University of Strathclyde, and I feel like ever since first year, we've really been encouraged to think about green strategies and materials, and always thinking about CLT and mass timber. And we've also had lots of environmental panel discussions. I, for example, wrote my bachelor's thesis on mass timber design in Scotland, and some other people wrote theirs on the circular economy and stuff like that. So when these excited young architects are entering the industry, I think that they're really helping to push clients and other design team members who are maybe a bit set in their ways to incorporating more green strategies early on. And while it may take some time for clients to start always choosing the environmentally friendly, but a little bit more expensive options, we're already seeing almost every new project incorporating sort of softer environmental strategies like green spaces, solar panels, better heating systems, and so on. So in conclusion, I think young architects just need to keep pushing for sustainability, like just keep nagging people and to keep challenging the sort of norms of the construction industry. And that's about me. I'd like to hand over to Amy and members of the V&A Dundee YPC.
Thank you, Tia. So I am Amy. I'm the learning producer for young people at V&A Dundee. I'll be in conversation this evening with representatives from V&A Dundee's Young People Collective. YPC is a group that meets weekly to co-design programme for 14 to 24-year-olds, developing new design-related skills and representing young people's voices throughout the museum. We currently have 2 members of YPC on the V&A Dundee board at the moment. First off, Kirsty, what do you imagine are the needs and values of future generations?
Hi there. So as a collective, the majority of us grew up in the early 2000s, and the phrase climate change wasn't really alien to us at this time. We were taught small ways that we could be more eco-friendly, such as walking to school, don't litter, and recycle. On reflection, these methods, although they are very important, seem very surface level, considering the level of political and ecological action required. And since we knew of this problem of such a young age, like we were at an awareness, but it wasn't really until recent years that the sheer magnitude of what faces future generations has been made apparent. And the resources available to this generation has made us more aware of the current environmental issues as we consume all this very prolific media, especially with the rise up of COP26. And with this, we kind of see a change of perspective from a finite timescale, which we have in order to create change, to more of an understanding of a finite existence. And with this, the phrase climate change has shifted to climate crisis. Also a sense of eco-anxiety, I think we're all very much experiencing right now. We need to change things, but we don't really have the power in politics. We feel there are restrictions on the input of young people. I think we require an equal representation and share of power to change the planet for the better. A formal place for young people to have their views and opinions heard to create an impact. As a collective, we hope for the future generations to kind of utilise and build upon the technology which we have, which allows us to live alongside the planet while being mindful of overconsumption of natural resources and synthetic products alike.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that. I also put a question to Noah. He's having trouble at the moment connecting to Zoom, so I will answer on behalf of him. The question I put to him was, what is important for a built environment to be or to include? His response on behalf of YPC is, a built environment needs to use what already exists. For a lot of buildings, this might include using natural and sustainable materials that are adapted to the local environment. It's important to pay more attention to how older buildings were built and to understand the materials they were built from. The questions raised by the RSA's 2020 brief specifies a home built to be used by multiple generations. An existing home that has been adapted and retrofitted to support an individual's independence, connectivity and inclusion whilst in their own home environment. A new housing model that encourages support multi-generational interaction and cohesion with the local community. A streetscape of homes that fosters community through encouraging neighbours to interact, socialise and participate in activities. In relation to this, it would be good to have more consideration for how retail and online shopping has changed the face of many cities, high streets, and perhaps look for alternative ways to have a sense of ownership of. All these problems are very complex, don't necessarily have an immediate solution, but primarily a built environment in the future should include a strong emphasis on long-term solutions that consider what their long-term effects might be. And we have Beth, who is going to answer our next question. Hi.
Hi.
So Beth, how do you imagine these built environments would tackle the climate crisis?
Well, what if we reused old materials, avoiding the production of new materials as much as possible, especially in cities where desolate buildings hold enough materials to make whole new structures? Can we think before we use? Can we reclaim used resources, recycle and bring life to old materials in a sustainable and suitable way? How much of an impact could that achieve? Even if it would only be small, it would be a step in the right direction to reduce the crisis. If spaces are rebuilt and adapted, they could be shown and shared around the world and be leading forces if these methods work. Being the design city of Scotland and speaking about these issues, can we be the driving force to changing how built environments can tackle the climate crisis? How many building materials can be reused and how much energy needs to be used to regenerate? Will construction waste be able to be reduced as well? This does beg the question, could a human environment, for example, a house or a block of office, be built to be regenerative, made to be long-lasting and climate positive? Would the use of carbon positive materials to build a house be able to be outweighed by the effects, or rather lack of negative effects on climate? Looking at buildings surrounding us, where is the investment for quality housing? People who can afford to have double, triple glazed windows are better insulation, have far more energy efficient homes than those who have single glazing and leak heat. Why is it only the people who have the money to spend on energy efficient and eco-friendly living that expect others with less to be up to their standards? As with the majority of social issues, it is more likely to be the people who have the most that brush the responsibility aside and demand it to be the people beneath them to deal and solve with the issues. As is always the case, money can help solve and greatly affect issues around the world, but why is it never put to saving the climate? A prominent example would be the fire in Notre Dame, where millionaires, billionaires instantly put vast amounts of money to rebuild the historic building. Why aren't they rushing to help the environment that they live in? With the amount that was pledged and assumingly paid, this could have dramatically aided in the need to prevent, reduce, and maybe reverse the climate crisis. As a method of reusable energy creation and saving, solar panels don't seem to impact the climate crisis. However, it is wholly dependent on the right weather conditions and being connected to a storage hub, as it cannot store its own electricity. It also takes, in average, between 5 to 10 years for the installation and use of solar panels to pay off. Would it be possible to justify using materials that production and installment contribute to the climate crisis for a longer positive payoff for the climate? The pandemic has been awful, but it has shown how people can come together and change to help in a global way. What would be needed to stop this climate crisis would be intense, and humanity would survive it. However, as seen with COVID, people want to go back to their normality. Their motivation to continue under the intense restrictions we faced through the pandemic wavers. And although we as a society would survive great changes to reverse global warming, how are we willing to give up our luxuries and normalities and have a great change? So how can we help the future generations? They will have to be dealing with this climate crisis for multiple generations down the line. If we can start dealing with the problems now, it will give our future children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren a head start and more time to solve what the past has triggered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, Beth and Noah, and the rest of YPC, and I'll now pass you on to Scott.
All right, thank you very much. I want to thank the other speakers who just came before me, because that was incredibly powerful, and I'd like to note that before I begin. So, yep, I'm just going to share my screen and then kick things off. So, yeah, as was kind of mentioned earlier, I've been a little bit wrapped up in COP26, but I really need to stress that alongside talks, I've been involved in lots of the protests that have been really calling out the systemic limitations of the COP process. So we also saw that it became a bit of a trade show for a net zero future, whilst we had more fossil fuel delegates than Indigenous communities represented. So that has to be said loud and clear. But just to introduce myself a little bit more, I am first and foremost a climate justice activist. So intergenerational climate and spatial justice are at the forefront of the work that I do. And this also moves into kind of tenants' rights and supporting work on the ground for those sorts of initiatives. So I'm going to go as provocative as possible, because we really need to end on some energy as well. So I unintentionally founded an architecture school 2.5 years ago, basically in response to the failure demands inspired by a system that's obsolete in the face of climate change. So what the Anthropocene Architecture School has done for the past kind of 2.5 years, and now 105 different events as of right now, is support built environment professionals and students, and occasionally invited by educators, to really respond to the climate ecological emergency like our house is on fire. Because this is a really difficult thing to, I think this can go away for now. This is something that we do need to recognize. I personally have a great deal of ecological grief and a climate anxiety that is set off quite often, and the COP process has made significantly more intense. But a big part of my work is challenging the inaction and non-response we have seen from the construction industry and governments internationally. So this is a little bit of a snapshot of what 2.5 years looks like when an educational program really takes the climate emergency more than half seriously. So I've now kind of lectured across Canada, Europe, across the UK, and as of last week, I spoke for Australians. And really just creating these spaces as often as possible, but making them honest and provocative as and when necessary. And before COVID-19 came in last year and kept things being online, this is what that work used to look like. So on the top left, there was the launch of the school at the Britannia Panopticon in Glasgow, so the world's oldest surviving Victorian music hall. There was an open kind of dialogue. There was then at Extinction Rebellion's Edinburgh Fringe residency in 2019 at Summer Hall, through to creating spaces and kind of other places. But these are not the main crux of what I'm going to try and getting at. So in early 2019, I quantified the knowledge gap we had around sustainable design with architecture students, because this is incredibly important. 90% of the damage buildings do is locked in by the earliest design decisions. And we had the kind of average understanding was below 60%. So typically we don't let people fly planes or do surgery as doctors when they have a below 60% understanding of something as impactful as buildings are on our natural world. So this led into lots of other kind of works as well. But something we really need to address in our education system and as a whole is that really recently the Architect Climate Action Network found that 76.9% of students did not feel their education was preparing them for their future. And this is because we have had an education system that has not recognized the climate emergency. So we have decades upon decades of architects and engineers and civil engineers, structural engineers who have not been taught that their work impacts climate change. And this is a real systemic shift that we need to be having around that conversation. And Daniel Christian Weil said it incredibly eloquently. So all that we design is an expression of our theories about the world. And the people we have making decisions in positions of power at the moment and are not aligning with those of young people are currently having a vested interest towards the continuation of things as they are. So unless we start to kind of unpack what our theories about the world are and where they come from, we're going to keep repeating the same sorts of patterns. So what's the work that I do is around climate literacy. So this is what's a big part of what's been missing in the education of architects and in kind of all education systems. We have not been looking at where every single job that we do links to climate. Every job now is effectively a climate job. And regardless if that's in the built environment, but also includes things like care, transportation as well. But climate literacy is about understanding that everything we do has the potential to be a positive response. So that's really trying to embed that and to get that discussed as much as humanly possible, because we still have a huge lasting inertia in our education systems to really take climate change seriously, because we are simply not getting there. So the kind of left-hand side of this graph sort of shows where we are today. So this is about like a conventional practice. So in Scotland, 14,000 homes were built in the past year, but only 8 of those homes were the highest standard of energy efficiency. So that's a kind of conventional practice that accepts doing environmental damage. But if we can kick this to the right-hand side into more restorative or regenerative design, so actively questioning our relationship with nature that has been sort of shifted by the kind of modernist architecture and grid acceleration, etc., we can start to bring that back. Buildings can actually start to do good. We can stop the damage control that sustainable design and net zero is, because we have these targets of net zero, which if we take the IPCC report seriously, no industrialized country should be aiming for 2050, because that's the global average. We should be aiming for 2030 at the absolute latest, as that's got climate justice at its heart and soul. So we really need to be questioning, why are our targets being set so far into the future, and challenging that loudly as well. And some of the work, so what can we do as practitioners in the built environment? What can schools of architecture catalyse, create? So as part of Scotland's Climate Fringe, before COP26 came to town, through the Anthropos Architecture School, I pulled together Scotland's first ever People's Assembly on climate and housing justice. Because in a climate emergency, all housing policy is climate policy. Those two are inseparable. So this pulled together tenants unions, trade unions, activists, architects, engineers, the public, and gave them the space to use participatory democracy techniques to really discuss housing policy and what's going to affect them immediately and affect future generations. Because unless we unpack our political system and create participatory democracy, such as people's and citizens' assemblies, we are going to keep hitting the same barriers, because it's a question of power. If young people are going to be empowered to design the future, they're going to have to mobilize and fight for it, because the way things are, they are not being given those opportunities. So really, just to pull this into one kind of final couple of sentiments, Rob Hopkins puts it quite kind of beautifully, that one of the biggest challenges we currently face is not kind of imagining utopias, but it's imagining feasible and delightful versions of the future that where things turned out okay. So not Mad Max, not Waterworld, but where things are better, where we actually have a just transition. So if you look at the UK, if we want to retrofit every building by 2050, we need 1,650,000 more people in the retrofit industry alone. So there's so much potential to do good things, but we are currently just not getting there. But also just on the provocative side, if young people are going to design the future, we need to give them the space, we need to empower them, and it can no longer be tokenistic kind of youth washing, as we did see a lot at the trade show parts of COP amongst panels and other things. So just to end on that sort of note, young people really do have the most skin in the game, to kind of paraphrase what's been said before, but we do not have equal power. And this is a question of power. So how do we empower young people to take that back and to actually create a livable future for all of us as well? Thank you very much. I will throw back to the panel as a whole, because I think that's how we're doing this.
Yes, could we have everybody switch on their mics and video? Right, Scott, since you finished with the question, I'm going to ask you your question back.
Oh, fantastic.
I think certainly my experience of doing the whole what if thing, there was this huge question about how young people get more engaged. And you asked the question, how do we empower young people to design the future? So again, in the spirit of the what if, as we go through the Q&A, I'm going to kind of ask everybody, if there was one thing you could change that might kind of change the course of things, what might that be in terms of empowering young people, and how do we kind of transfer that power? What would you do?
Oh, would you like me to take that first? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm really tired. But yeah, okay, if that's one thing, I would say that has to start in politics. Oh, is it back?
Yeah, I can hear you. With what, sorry?
Okay, right, so it has to start in politics. So currently we have a democracy that is kind of, you vote once every 5 years, people make decisions on your behalf for 5 years with little to no sort of follow-up accountability. So I would say we need a proper functioning citizens' assembly in Scotland that has power, that is not disempowered, or like the climate assembly that was run, that has real sort of, real tangible democratic might. Because when people's assemblies and citizens' assemblies are used, people learn a great deal. To give one example, when you ask Scotland's Climate Assembly how many people agreed that all of our buildings should be retrofitted by 2030, after they've been given the science, the understanding, the expertise, 98% of them agreed. So that just shows, if you treat people like adults and you give them the science and the understanding, you get much more, not even radical, you get pragmatic, and you get responses of the magnitude that the climate emergency necessitates. A citizens' assembly would say 2045 is far too late, and it's not embracing climate justice, that's heart and soul. So I would say a citizens' assembly front and center by next year at the absolute latest.
Great. I have another related question to that, and it was at a point I thought you raised, which was very interesting. There was some commentary in this during COP, which is, why are the targets so far in the future when actually most of the politicians making these promises either won't be in power anymore, or might not even be here? So that's a kind of observation, but
I'd say
I was interested in your...
It's just, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd say that it's procrastination. You don't have to act on something when it's 2 or 3 decades in the future. And any target beyond 2025 is in total denial of climate science. That's just fact. So if we're not it's not being taken seriously, and current kind of government structures are not set up to respond like it's an emergency. We have not seen an emergency response yet in Scotland. An emergency response would look radically transformatively different. But we are not seeing that. We've especially not seen that in construction as well, not in our built environments.
So I kind of given you 2 wishes, but they were really the Citizens' Assembly and actually shortening the timescales for the targets. So actually those in power actually have responsibility for acting within the timescales that are actually in power.
Absolutely. I would say if you can stretch that to 3 wishes, I would say building regulations that actually recognize climate science, because our building regulations are atrocious. And I'll stop there. I probably spoke too much. I'm probably going to fall asleep at some points as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Scott. I'd like to just pass on to Beth, Kirsty, and Noah, if you're still on. There was a range of kind of very, very strong views came across here, and this sense of kind of eco-anxiety kind of came across very clearly. But I'm kind of keen to pose the wish question to the 3 of you, in that you're all very actively involved. But if you had the power to change things, what like the question I posed to Scott, what would be the number one thing you would change that might kind of fundamentally shift direction and accelerate change?
I'll pop in here. Like Scott said, politics is the number one issue, because you cannot really get any power unless you go through the political system, who, again, as Scott said, like to procrastinate from things. However, say we did get through the political barrier that we are facing and managed to get the option and the ability to speak and have meaning and power behind it, I think we have enough as a collective of young people to know that we have to act now. And it's just about bringing it together and again, just having funds behind us and support behind us enough to get it through. But the problem is that people look at young people and not necessarily always see immaturity, but it's always the view of, we have not lived enough experience for them to take us seriously. So if we can get that through, that we haven't lived as much, but we do want to live, then that might help our case.
So would that be something akin to Scott's suggestion of a citizens' assembly that involved all ages?
Yeah, definitely. But even with that, like outside of a governmental environment, like having community groups that all act independently but towards the same goal, so that they are not solely relying on not solely relying on one another, but it means that the views can be spoken out, and depending where you are will depend on what you do for the environment, because something that may everything will benefit the environment no matter where you are. However, some places need it more than others.
And Kirsty, you talked about places for young people to share their views. Is that something you have thoughts on as well?
Just checking. Yes, my mic is on. Yeah, they're kind of piggybacking off Scott and Beth there. I think it starts with politics as well. And I think there needs to be, it's kind of like I mentioned before, I think a lot of small actions are being taken by individuals, like switching the way they travel or what they buy, the food they eat, every little thing to make an individual impact, which is good. And I think a point we actually raised when we were chatting about this at YPC is the sort of greenwashing that has kind of come off the sort of recognition of the climate crisis, like by certain businesses, like, yes, we do this, small things, which all build up, which do make a really good impact. But I think the time for small actions has been kind of come and gone, and there has been a level of procrastination, like Scott said. So I think, yeah, it's time for big actions, if you understand me.
But big actions in still, are you suggesting still a local context? Because what I was interested in your comment is that you talked about taking it starts with politics, but a kind of local level of politics, because it, in some sense, is the bigger the group involved in the discussion, the less weight there is on individual shoulders that they feel they need to do something because, oh well, somebody else will do that. Mm-hmm. It's almost about everybody bearing the responsibility to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Noah, you talked about Noah. Are you on screen? I can't see you.
Hello, I am here now.
No, hi.
Last half hour trying to get back on.
So Amy did your spot, but is there anything you want to add to what Beth and Kirsty said around these kind of questions about, if there was, what's the number one thing you would look to change if you're able to do so?
Just from a personal perspective, I think like an education and understanding, especially like a material understanding. In a way, like you were mentioning earlier when you explained to the local council about retrofitting buildings, it was a unanimous vote. And I think to understand our built environment better is a good way forward, especially, there's retrofitting buildings, and then there's understanding how the buildings work, and using the sort of vernacular and traditional techniques that are much lower impact often from an environmental perspective.
Okay. And Katrina, you made a reference to, you felt a lot of the stuff at COP young people was a bit tokenistic. So how would you approach making it the approach less tokenistic? You know, what thing would you be keen to see? You know, what mechanism might there be to authentically involve the voices of young people?
So I've been thinking about this whilst all the other panelists were kind of sharing as well. And I'm really struggling with the idea about what one thing. I think there are tens of things, maybe hundreds of things that we need to be doing kind of simultaneously. So I'm going to limit myself to two, being in the context of this.
You can have two.
Yeah. So one, which I think is very practical, is, you know, I think the idea of consultation has been exhausted, and I think we need to move beyond consultation, particularly when it comes to things like the built environment. And I wonder if one way to centre children and young people as part of making decisions about our places would be to make everything co-designed by children and young people, and if adults participate in those processes but use the materials that are set for children, rather than the kind of current situation of kind of maybe at best some maybe tokenistic consultation with young people, and at worst like the actual omission of them because the GDPR is too difficult, or because they're transient student populations, so they don't really care about where they're living, or like loads of excuses like I've heard about that in terms of including young people. So that's one thing. And I think organizations like A Place in Childhood are doing amazing work in that kind of area. And then my second, which is much more big picture, is kind of, I think if we redefine wealth and value in our society, we'll definitely make a huge step forward in terms of working more closely with young people and actually an intergenerational equity. And it still astounds me that we have not done that already, that we're only now just talking about a well-being economy, about a just and green economy, particularly being someone who kind of came of age during the 2008 financial crisis. It's like, I can't believe there's now future generations who are having to live through that similar thing. So those are my two.
Do you think that there is already perhaps a bit of redefinition of wealth and value post-pandemic?
To an extent, I think it's a real challenge not to have a bounce back mentality. And I think community-led, locally led projects that were kind of emboldened through the kind of localism that was the limit of COVID-19 has really kind of helped, but it's only if we continue to invest in those places, in those people, that we'll actually be able to see the benefit of that, rather than it be something which we then again go back to relying on the time of the people who can afford to volunteer, rather than actually putting money where our mouth is when it comes to local investment.
Yes, I think there's an interesting time with the climate emergency becoming acute and the focus of COP and coming out of lockdown, that the kind of previously held view that this is too difficult, oh, you don't understand, it can't happen. Well, perhaps everything that's happened in the pandemic showed that, well, actually, if it's really, really important, anything can happen. Through how quickly the vaccines were developed and the furlough and everything that's happened with that. And in the What If project, what we've tried to do was to turn the whole engagement process around and try and bring it down to something absolutely direct and fundamental. We call it Architecture Unplugged on some occasions. And yes, I completely agree. Consultation is too often retrospective and tokenistic, and it's seeking endorsement of something which is already relatively fixed. But I think one of the really gratifying things that came out of the What If is that it felt an authentic process, and that voices were heard, and there was no filter on it. It was a person talking directly to an architect designer about the hopes and wishes for the future. And certainly, I think for me, the best things to come out of the whole thing was that that's now really been recognised, particularly within Dundee, where there was a lot of work done with young people and communities in Dundee in and around the design of the new high school, and that's now going to get embedded in that process within the education department in the city. So I think it's early days, but I completely agree. It's authentic co-design is the answer. So Graham, I'll come to you now. I really regret not going to any of your events that you organised in COP. But engage in terms of kind of going beyond that into kind of regular times. What would your thoughts be on how to embed the ideas and views of young people in the process of how places are made? I'm going to ask you the wish question. What you think might help to change the direction of that?
Well, I don't think there is any normal time anymore. We're in an environmental crisis that is effectively a much, much larger wave than a pandemic. But I think I guess like just listening to everyone else respond to this, it kind of validates everything that I've been thinking about as well. And I think that what Noah said about like education, we need more integrated education into everything that we do. I think that Scott and the Anthropocene school that he runs needs to be engaged directly within the architecture departments that are within Scotland. And I think that education will play like a huge role. Colin, the young boy who done the mural, he was talking about how he is really engaged, but that he barely gets taught anything about the environmental crisis at school. And it should be that in maths and English and French and science and every single subject, it is being discussed as part of that. And whether that be like a maths question is focused around the environmental emergency. Like I think that it could be something that education plays a really key role in everything that we're doing. But also going on what Scott said as well, I think that like climate anxiety is something that I've definitely felt as well, and I'm sure that everyone else on the panel feels. And I think that we can only start to address the anxiety that we're feeling at a local level. Within Scotland, we find ourselves in a country that you know everyone by default. You've got like 2 or 3 degrees of separation to pretty much everyone that you constantly find out about. And I think that having that connection is really important as we move forward, because I think we can make change, and we can make change really, really quickly. So one of the first things that we'd done is after the pandemic was around donut economics, and I think that like the integration of donut economics, the wellbeing economy, the universal basic income is something that is really important to the future of Scotland. But I also think that Scotland can, its communities, if we empower them and give them the funding, give them the means to do it, we can make really radical change at a really local level. So one of the events, Ewan, that we held, I'm just going to finish on this point at COP26, was around football, and we effectively that was held on the 8th of November, and I'm not going to lie, we didn't have that event planned until we started planning it on the 1st of November, and it was purely just because someone got in touch and said, we want to do this, we want to present it. And we invited Football for Futures, which is an English organisation, so they work primarily in the English Premier League. And when they came along, they were talking about, we work with Chelsea, we work with Tottenham, but it's going to be 10, 20, 30 years before they actually make any difference within that, because of the clubs are so huge. But then you come to Scotland, and within the space of 1 week, we had Hibernian, Stenhousemuir, the Scottish Football Supporters Association, all like represented as part of the panel session. So I think that Scotland has a chance to be a leader, and I think that sometimes we call ourselves world leaders. I think that is often like batted about, but I think that we can be a leader in community engagement and really giving power to local people, and that we've got a parliament that can listen and can be swayed. And just look at Nicola Sturgeon changing her views on the Campbell oil field yesterday, being that was solely led by young people, and I think that that's something that we need more of. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of blabbering now, but that would be my opinion on the question.
Thanks very much, Graham. I think just reflecting on that, I think, yeah, absolutely. One of the real benefits of Scotland is that, you know, political leaders at both a national and local level are far more accessible than in other parts of the UK. And even at a local level during the pandemic, the way that, say, in Edinburgh, where I am right now, the planning rules were immediately lifted, and yeah, cafes and bars could colonise the pavement on Leith Walk, and cycle lanes almost appeared overnight, which could have, in normal circumstances, could have taken years to actually go through a whole bureaucratic process. But okay, we need to do this now, let's do it. We'll put it up on a temporary basis, and they're still they're operational overnight. They're not necessarily a permanent structure, but they're operational overnight, and immediately the way people use the city in a much more sustainable way is there, and it's open, and it's a much safer way to move around the city. So I'm going to move on to questions from the audience now. I have one from Brian Evans, who is asking about a climate assembly which was piloted in 2020. So are the panel aware of this and think it might be a model for engagement? Brian, you've caught me out. I don't know that much about it.
I've seen that Scott did a little reply in the writing form. Maybe Scott, if you want to just summarise a little bit, and then I think we are pretty much running out of time, so that might have to be our last question.
No, I will pass to a question for Tia instead. I've typed it in the response, and no one should be left out. So I will throw the buck, and can someone take another question? I've written it down, so my response is there. But yeah, let's keep everyone included and involved.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, and Tia, can I kind of come back to you? I mean, you've clearly, embedded very heavily in the work you're now working on at Collective. Do you find is it your experience, being a relatively recent graduate, that architectural education is lacking?
Yeah, I was just thinking that when Scott was speaking, I was saying earlier that University of Strathclyde were encouraged to do like our own research into climate sort of practices, but that all sort of comes from the tutors and from the students themselves. There's so much sort of self-initiation and sort of looking into these things, and so many people just decide, well, because you've got the bachelor's thesis and you've got the master's thesis, and that's a huge chunk of your sort of education, and you sort of have to prioritize, like, do I spend that doing something sort of, looking at social issues and stuff like that, or do I actually look into a very detailed part of like circular economy or like a sustainable method of construction? And sure, it might be easier to write like loads about social issues and stuff like that, but then I think it's, for me at least, it was worth it, like going to all these sort of mass timber events and sort of traveling to Edinburgh for panels for that as well, and sort of just trying to make myself more motivated to look into that. But I do feel like for the actual like curriculum, there isn't enough written in there for like proper like detailing and stuff like that being actually taught in a classroom setting. So I think it is just self-motivation, which is great, but it needs to be pushed by for the universities as well. So yeah.
Good, thank you. For those who may think that my request for one wish or one thought was perhaps simplistic for a load of complex issues, I think it's always important with these events to get some kind of outcome, so that from this discussion there's a kind of clear set of outcomes that can actually be taken forward and be the record of this evening's discussion, which has been a fantastic discussion. I wish it could carry on further, but I'm going to hand back to Nicole now to wrap up.
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists and V&A Dundee's YPC and Ewan and Jim for your wonderful sharing and intros. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you all here. You're welcome to just say your thanks and then turn your video off, and I'll just do some quick closing thoughts. So if you want to do that now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much for being here. Also, thanks to Scotland and Venice, our partners on this event, to Creative Scotland, the Scottish Government, National Gallery Scotland, and Architecture and Design Scotland, who have all done so much to support the project and the events programme. Before I wrap up, I just want to highlight some upcoming programme at V&A Dundee. Next week, we have a free lunchtime talk online called The Tale of Two Cities, the Jutopolis of Empire, which will see Dr. Bashabi Fraser consider the role of jute in the economic and colonial histories of Dundee and Calcutta. That'll be a really interesting chat, and it's free, so please do book online. And then on Thursday, the 2nd of December, we will be welcoming audiences back into the museum again for an in conversation with Ben Kelly, the designer of one of Manchester's most iconic nightclubs, the Hacienda, which is currently featuring an Night Fever exhibition. Ben will be joined by photographer and artist Eugene Schlumberger and Ross Hunter of Graven Images to discuss and give an exclusive preview of the upcoming new book, Hacienda Landscapes, ahead of its release in the winter, which will be on the Hacienda's 40th anniversary. Links to both of those events have been posted in the chat, so please do jump on and book. And all that is left for me to say is thank you once again for joining, and have a wonderful evening.